who are we as strategizers? Who are we as role players? We get to play around with our own identity in a way that is a little bit safer than it can be in the real world.
Welcome to Velocitize Talks. I'm Andy North, and today my guest is Jessica Creane, founder and CEO of IKantKoan. Jessica, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Andy.
So you have an outstandingly interesting background. Not only are you founder and CEO of IKantKoan, but you are a professor of game design at Drexel University, a playwright, and a climate change game designer with the National Park Service, among many other titles and activities. You do stay busy. Tell us about your journey as a marketer and how IKantKoan sets itself apart in the marketplace.
The journey. I started out as a theater kid is really where it all began. I really loved performance and started thinking about storytelling from a young age. I was a writer for a long time. Sorry, I went way back. I hope that's what you were asking. And so as I started to sort of grow into who I was going to be when I grew up, I started thinking about play a lot and sort of thinking about it in the lens of theater, and quickly realized that I found it infinitely more interesting to make theater than I did to watch it. And I started wondering why it was that it was so fun to be in the room doing all of this problem solving and figuring out the best way to tell stories and to move people. And it was so often not the case, or not as stimulating to watch those stories get played out. We were just sort of not privy to all of the nuances of figuring those things out collaboratively. And so that's what ultimately moved me into game design, was that everyone can be a player in that space. And so the equity of that and the challenge of finding out how everyone involved can have an embodied experience around learning and story is what moved me into figuring out, moving from plays to the act of play. And I went to grad school, and sort of in my last semester ended up taking a class in game design that led me to start the company and led me into all of this exploration of what play means in our lives.
Tell us about your agency. What brought about the creation of it, and what sets you apart in the marketplace?
I had not thought about creating a company until I started making games. And one of the first games that I made was a destructible game. And so it's played in about 5 minutes. And the extent of the game is that it can be played. It can continue to be played beyond the lifespan of the natural players. And so you can create these games that they live on for inordinate amounts of time. And also the game pieces are destroyed. Some of them are destroyed over the course of play. And so I got some advice that if I was going to go ahead and make games that could only be played once and were going to be destroyed, then I might want to have some legal protections. And so that's really where it came from. And then from there, I started thinking about what a company can do and sort of what it's like to bring people together in such a way that we can have a greater impact. And so what we do a lot of is really taking the things that folks don't want to think about or look at in their lives and finding ways to make it so alluring. So things like chaos and the scariness of being in love, and what it's like to have a personal life philosophy, or to learn about the philosophies of others, or to think about climate change in a way that doesn't immediately send us into a hopeless spiral of hell. And so really taking a look at the serious subject matter and trying to make it, if not joyful, at least satisfying.
You have an interesting TED Talk about embracing uncertainty through play, which is some of what you were just talking about. Talk about that relationship between games and play and how it can help us get through times of uncertainty.
Yeah, I think those two things often get conflated. Games are playful, and play is not always game. Games are very structured. There is a system to games. There's usually a win and a loss state. There are usually rules attached. It's usually a system. And so you can figure out what that system is pretty quickly. There are tutorials or there are rules. And so you know that you're playing within a world that operates a little bit differently than the real world. Play is a little bit more organic than that. It is emergent. And the reason that we play games is because we don't know what's going to happen in them. We don't know what will happen next. And that uncertainty can be really exciting for us when we play games. But those two things are very different, but they play really well together. So when you combine the structure of games, having some grounding, knowing what you're doing in a world, with the fact that anything can happen, we end up in a really highly agentic world where we get to make choices that are really meaningful for us, and also where we get to test our own boundaries and limits. Who are we as strategists? strategizers? Who are we as role players? We get to play around with our own identity in a way that is a little bit safer than it can be in the real world. So they provide amazing training grounds for us. And with the right bridges or the right mentors, the right context, we can sort of bridge the learning gap between who we are in games that we play and who we are in our real lives. So that's the space that excites me the most, is how is it that we take in-game learning and apply it to our real lives in a way that feels really organic, emergent, exciting, and sort of inevitable by the end of an experience.
You wrote a playable theater show called Chaos Theory, which I think is great, which recently won the Best Social Immersion Award from Immersion Nation. Congratulations, by the way. First of all, what is a playable theater show and what is Chaos Theory about?
Playable theater is, it's sort of like going to a play, but if the play could never progress if there were no audience. So even if there was no one in the audience for Hamlet, Hamlet could still go on. For playable theater, it doesn't really work like that. The audience is an inherent and essential part of the production. So for a piece like Chaos Theory, it's interactive. And so we try really hard. We worked really hard to create a piece where no one is ever going to be put on the spot. So a lot of people, I think of interactive theater as something where like, oh, a performer is going to bring me up on stage and I'm going to somehow be embarrassed in the process. I will be there to be the brunt of a joke. But playable theater at its best really does none of that. And it empowers people to take actions throughout the piece. And so the way that Chaos Theory works is folks come into a lecture on Chaos Theory, which ends up sort of going off the rails in such a way that the woman who's running the lecture, who I play, her name is Dr. Sayak, she sort of just goes and starts talking about her love life is how it begins, because that's where so much chaos in all of our lives are. And so she starts playing through these experiments with the audience and asking them to be a part of her processing of the chaos of her own life. And she is a professional chaologist. And so she's tying all of these mathematical formulas to the chaos that she experiences in her own personal and professional life. So the audience ends up playing through these experiments, which are actually games over the course of the piece. And ultimately it moves from a narrative about her life into the narrative of the audience's lives. And they end sort of running experiments about their own lives to figure out who they want to be and how they want to embrace chaos in their lives.
Today, so many people are afraid of asking questions for fear of being seen as not knowledgeable about a given topic or not up to date on a certain topic. You are a big proponent of not only asking questions, but asking the right questions to move us forward as artists and intellectuals. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think that the questions require us to be fearless sometimes, or they train us to be fearless. I think you have to sort of go through the fear of asking questions in order to be less fearful. And so for what it usually means for me is if there's something that I'm not saying, it takes me a little while to figure out that I'm not saying it. And then I'll start to notice clues in my body. My chest tightens up or my brow furrows or my jaw is locked. And then I sort of realize that there's something that I'm not saying, and I'm confused about it or feeling some shame around not knowing. And so those are usually the moments that it gets easy to sort of say, okay, I'm just never going to ask that, or never going to even know that this was a block for me. And so I think when we're training ourselves to ask the right questions, it begins with feeling it in our bodies. When are the moments where we feel blocked or stuck or frustrated? And then from there, you can sort of shine a light and say, why do I feel this way? Oh, it's because I feel like I should be an expert in this realm, and yet I don't know this thing that I am being asked. So
are you helping others take that initial leap into the abyss, if you will, of not knowing something, admitting it, and then learning?
Yeah, absolutely. I do some of it as a coach, as like an entrepreneurial coach, which is pretty straightforward. And then a lot of it really comes through games and play, especially like Chaos Theory ends up asking people over the course of the piece very slowly, where is the chaos that you feel in your life and what are you going to do about it? And a lot of what I do in that piece is, as a performer, is model some of that behavior to say, this is what it looks like to take a risk when you're questioning your own identity at like level 10. And so then others can feel empowered to question who they are and how to move forward at a level like 3 or 4 or 5.
You have talked about the power of taking risks and how you come out of it better as a better person. Is that an accurate statement?
Absolutely. Yeah, we never know what we're capable of until we're faced with it. There aren't a ton of people who are willing to jump into the abyss in their own right. Those who are pretty brave, I think. And it's a different kind of bravery to be forced into taking risks. But for me, I sort of think of it like sidewalk, like cracks in a sidewalk. Like it's sort of like there's a magical world underneath the sidewalk, but you'll never know it unless you break it open a little bit. And so I think that really what uncertainty is for us is that the world is falling apart a little bit around us. There are cracks under our feet. And if we just keep going, if we keep our eyes up, we're going to fall into that abyss. But if we look down and start to examine what those cracks are, we start to see ways in which it can actually be positive growth for us, in which like plants can sort of spring out of those cracks. And so it takes a really curious mind, I think, to go into risk taking without any fear. But I think the fear is necessary. If we didn't feel fear about uncertainty, then it really wouldn't be as much of an act of bravery to face those things.
What is the best professional advice that you've ever given, been given, or heard?
The best advice comes from my mom. She's been telling me this since I was a kid, that one thing always leads to the next thing. And I think that gave me permission. It's given me permission my whole life to know that I am not the end all be all self right now, that I'm always going to be in progress, and that even if I made the wrong choice in this moment, it will lead me to the next thing that will be either back on track or a whole new path that I didn't know that I was going to be in. She went back to grad school when I was a kid. So like we grew up with her making a strong left turn in her career. And so I think that's really always stayed with me. One thing will always lead to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing.
Is there a book, a blog, or a podcast that you'd like to share with our viewers?
Yeah, I just finished a fantastic book a few that I really won't shut up about. One is The Idiot by Elif Batuman. It was just one of the driest and funniest books that I have read in a really long time, and I absolutely loved it. And God, Human, Animal, Machine by Megan O'Gillian, which was also fantastic. It's a philosophy book, and it's really all about what is the nature of consciousness, but deeply relatable and very much tied into her own personal experiences and very, very readable. Those were two of the best things I've read so far. And I listen to the Farnham Street podcast pretty religiously.
This has been truly fascinating. My guest today has been Jessica Creane, founder and CEO of IKantKoan. Jessica, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for having me.